Okay, Rosemary, why don't you go ahead?
Greetings, everyone, and thank you very much for joining this North-South conversation on climate change and displacement, hosted by the World Refugee and Migration Council and co-sponsored with Massey College and Massey's series on Missing COP26. The World Refugee and Migration Council has made climate change displacement a priority area of our focus and our research and our advocacy and outreach. And today is one example of this outreach to a global expert community. I'm Rosemary McCarney, and I'm a member of the World Refugee Migration Council, and I'm joined today by three outstanding experts from Brazil, from the United States, and from Canada on the accelerated challenge of human displacement that's caused by climate change. So let me introduce our panelists today. I'll begin with Professor Robert McLeman, who is the Professor of Geography and Environmental Studies at the Wilfrid Laurier University, an author that many of you have read on influential studies on the impact of climate change on migration and displacement, including the widely used textbook by many of our students, Climate and Human Migration. Robert's been an advisor and continues to be an advisor to many governments and global institutions. And he's also currently leading the lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the 6th Assessment Report, and is responsible for the scientific team that's assessing the impacts of climate change on human health, well-being, the migration and violence and conflict that flows from it. So welcome, Robert. Joining us today from Sao Paulo, Brazil is Erika Pires Ramos, a Brazilian federal attorney and researcher with a doctorate in international law from the University of Sao Paulo. And Erika is the co-founder of the South American Network for Environmental Migrations and is also currently involved with the Latin American Observatory on Human Mobility, Climate Change, and Disasters. Also joining us from Washington today is Professor Siders, who at the University of Delaware in the Disaster Research Center, the Biden School of Public Policy and Administration, and the Department of Geography and Spatial Sciences at the College of Earth, Ocean, and the Environment. Professor Siders holds a JD from Harvard Law School and a PhD from Emmett in the Interdisciplinary Program in Environment and Resources at Stanford University. She served as an environmental fellow at the Harvard University Center for the Environment, a legal fellow at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University, and a presidential management fellow with the US Navy. Her research, which we'll hear quite a bit about today, is on climate change adaptation and the decision-making and evaluation of how and why people decide when and where and how to adapt to the effects of climate change and the processes associated around risk reduction and equity outcomes as a result of those decisions. Our objective today for this panel discussion is to universalize climate change effects and at the same time differentiate its local impacts and responses, and hence the idea of a north-south dialogue. And while our focus will be on human displacement, it will be relevant for us to draw in the impact on physical infrastructure as well, which when not in place or damaged from climate-induced extreme weather also causes displacement. So as we paint a picture through a question and answer that I'll moderate with this panel on how climate change is being managed or not by levels of government and the spectrum of displacement across various parts of the world and national and local responses to it, we want to build some knowledge and debate around how to do this where we have resource scarce environments and their ability to mitigate or to build resiliency. I'm also hoping that we're going to be able to address the complexities of causal effect in climate change induced movement and give both credence and new vocabulary that makes a multi-causal working definition as opposed to a reason to do nothing when we cannot show singular direct cause and effect. And we will bring in the legal and normative gaps that need to be addressed so that this category of involuntary movement is able to address the protection needs of displaced populations. So while our focus is going to be on those who cross borders, we're very cognizant of the fact that internal displacement and divergent capacities across the North and South are fundamental to the ability to cope. So let's get started. And for those joining us, thank you very much. And if you would put your questions into the Q&A rather than the chat box, that would be most helpful. And we will, without question, have enough time to address those questions. A few questions have come in ahead of time, and we appreciate those. I think we've incorporated quite a bit of that already, but if not, be sure to flag those to me. And again, thank you for joining us today. So Robert, I'm going to start with you. Would you try and paint us a bit of a picture just in terms of the scale and scope of climate change displacement that we need to confront and address? Where are we going on this? Because the numbers seem to range across such a broad spectrum that sometimes I worry that because the numbers are so diverse, depending on where they're coming from, that it tests the credibility of what we're saying in substance as well. But if if we debate causation, we seem to, I think, conflate refugee determination and migration. And so could you kind of paint us that broad picture to get us started?
Sure, Rosemary, and thank you for having me. Thanks to the World Refugee and Migration Council. And I'll try to move quickly through this and give a crash course on the basic underlying science in 5 minutes or less, so I don't suck all the life out of this panel discussion. And thanks to those who are watching. So the first thing is to say this is not a hypothetical that we're talking about here. Each year, tens of millions of people are displaced from their homes by extreme storms, floods, droughts, wildfires, and other weather-related events. And the International Displacement Monitoring Center in Europe keeps tabs on these things and produces statistics. And so in the first 6 months of last year, 2020, they estimate that nearly 10 million people, so 9.8 million people around the world, were displaced from their homes by weather-related disasters. And the biggest countries, or the countries where this happened at the greatest scale, were countries that span the world, from India, Bangladesh, the Philippines, China, Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, Congo, and Brazil. So we're talking about a huge swath of the globe that experiences this. And IDMC's numbers tend to be quite conservative because they're looking at large-scale events where humanitarian organizations or governments are putting numbers on hundreds or thousands of people per event. And it does not count all these smaller changes in populations that are attributable to climate-related events, whether it's a farmer who has lost her crops 3 years in a row because of water scarcity and decides that, okay, now I have to move. So a lot of it gets sort of lost in those numbers. But the point being is that it's happening right now. And changes in the climate caused by human activity, burning of fossil fuels, creating concrete, deforestation, are going to increase the number of these events in the future and increase their severity in many regions. And on top of that, we're going to have the added effects of sea level rise in coastal areas where approximately 10% of the human population lives. So we're moving into an era when there will be larger numbers of people each year displaced by weather-related events amplified by the effects of climate change. And so you mentioned in your question, Rosemary, we get these estimates that say, well, in some cases it's millions, 10 millions, hundreds of millions, even billions of people who will be at risk in coming decades. So how do we make sense of that? One of the reasons we have such uncertainty is because there's actually 4 sets of uncertainties that we have to deal with. One is, are we going to actually do something about greenhouse gas emissions? Because if we tackle that, if we implement the Paris Agreement and move forward on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we avoid a lot of those really bad case scenarios that will happen in coming decades. The second uncertainty is development pathways. Are we going to continue to live in a world where there are 1 billion people who live on $1 a day and have trouble feeding their families? Or are we going to move into a more equitable world? Because in a world that's more equitable, people have more adaptive capacity and can adjust and cope with climate hazards in ways other than migration or distress migration or displacement. A third uncertainty is demographic change. Right now, there's 7.8 billion people in the world. The UN estimates there'll be 10 billion people by the year 2050. Those extra 2 billion people will primarily be added to South Asia and to Africa. Those are the fastest growing continents right now. And if you look at the risks of climate change, a lot of the amplification effects of climate change in terms of weather disasters are in those exact areas, especially in large coastal cities where many of these people are going to live in the future. And then the final uncertainty is migration policy, which is one of the things I know we want to talk about here, which is, are we going to continue to live in the world where high-income countries try to build walls and keep people from moving? Or are we going to think of this as a global challenge that we can manage and work with and look at things like how can we use labor migration to facilitate the movement of people, the acquisition of assets and the development of lower income countries. So that's why the numbers range so much when we look into the future, because it depends a lot on what we do now in the next 10 to 20 years, what will happen in the next 50 to 75 years. So just to give you a few examples though, the World Bank in 2018 released a report called Groundswell, and they looked at these scenarios for Central America, for Sub-Saharan Africa, and for South Asia. And they said the range of people who will be displaced by climate change between now and 2050 will vary enormously depending on those policy directions that we take. If we do nothing, if we choose the worst option in each of those cases, over 140 million people will be displaced from their homes, they estimate, by mid-century. Conversely, if we work in a positive, constructive direction in all these areas, the numbers come way down into perhaps the single digits. Still not ideal, but we're talking about huge uncertainties. So those are some of the numbers. You talked about causation. So again, I'm going to move very quickly through causation. Sometimes it's pretty obvious a weather-related disaster displaces people. When Hurricane Dorian blows through the Grand Bahamas and Abaco Island, people are displaced from their homes and many can't go back. So it's obvious what the driver is there. But as I mentioned earlier, there are other places and other situations where the driver is not so obvious. How many years of drought or water scarcity does it take for a household to lose its livelihood and then be obliged to migrate and to move to the city? It sort of goes beneath the radar. And so you get this huge range of potential causal, direct and indirect causal chains. And that's one of the things we talk about in the science is multi-causality. Sometimes it's pretty obvious that climate change or climate events are the key driver, but often they interact with social, economic, and cultural factors. And certain people are more vulnerable than others. People who are impoverished, people who live in families where there's no single breadwinner, gender, age, basic social inequities that we see every day around us amplify people's vulnerability to climate change. And then just to sort of bring it together finally is the outcomes are multi-directional as well. There's a lot of research that's been done, for example, in Southern Africa by colleagues at University of North Carolina, who can show that a single climate event can trigger a whole bunch of different types of migration responses, again, depending on the wherewithal of the people exposed. Some people will migrate, some people will actually be less likely to migrate, and sometimes the same event will generate this churn of people. One final example from the United States, when Hurricane Katrina knocked down the levees in New Orleans, people left, everybody had to leave, but certain groups came back. Certain people could not come back, and often there were racial and social inequalities that determined that. But you also had an influx of people of Latin American origin who were taking up employment opportunities in the reconstruction. So you had this hugely rich and diverse mix of movements of people from a single event. So that, I think, is a very quick crash course on some of the underlying uncertainties. But at the same time, one thing we can be certain about is that if we do nothing about this, if we continue on our merry way and ignore the underlying drivers of climate change, ignore the social and economic inequalities in society, and continue to go about these really closed-minded migration policies at a global scale, we are going into a situation where indeed tens, if not hundreds of millions of people will be at risk of displacement within the lifetime of many people who are on this call today.
Thank you very much. I mean, that was absolutely across the waterfront, great setup for this discussion. And I love your juxtaposition between certainty, if we make no decisions or poor decisions, and then the complexity of everything we're feeding into, which actually leads well to CITERS. If I could come to you, because building on Robert's overview, my takeaway from the COVID experience is that science is least best at understanding human behavior in the face of threat. And Robert has started to outline, just from one single disaster type situation, the range of behaviors and actions that people take. It's what we know and don't know about environmental change as a driver of migration and displacement. It's been a lot of your scholarly research. Why don't you jump in?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having this conversation today. Robert, thank you for that amazing overview. I will do my best to add on to that, but I'm not sure I can do much better. One reason modeling human behavior in risk is really difficult is that as humans, we are really bad at thinking about risk and at talking about risk, especially at some social levels. We're really bad at thinking about what levels of risk we are willing to tolerate and what sacrifices we are willing to make right now in order to prevent future harms. Right? In the US, the Texas electric shutoffs are forcing a conversation about this right now, right? How much are we willing to pay to enhance infrastructure to ensure that things like this never happened before? Every time there's a hurricane, right? We will never let this happen again. Well, but really, how much are we willing to pay to make sure that never happens again? And these are very difficult conversations. And they're difficult conversations because there's not a mathematical answer. This is an ethical and a value answer. And it's going to be different everywhere and different for different people. It's also difficult because we have some cognitive biases that make it difficult for us to think about this. We tend to think that we underestimate the chances that really terrible risks will happen. We don't really talk about the worst case scenarios. We talk about the minor things that are going to happen. We have an optimism bias. We think, oh, that's something that'll happen somewhere else, but it surely won't happen to us. All right, I think we see that really clearly, especially when we talk about migration. In the United States and Canada, we often talk about migration as something that will happen somewhere else. Right? That's a problem that will happen in another country, another place. It won't affect us. It won't affect the way I live my life. And that's false. It will affect us, and it will affect our countries, and it will affect our communities. But we have a really difficult time accepting that. And then we prefer the status quo, even when the way the world is not great. And we can acknowledge that, and we can acknowledge that there are lots of things wrong with our society or with societies around the world. We tend to cling to the bad things that we know rather than taking opportunities for new risks. And this can affect the way people think about migration, right? Some people see migration as an opportunity where they're moving to something. We live in countries where a large number of our residents, right, are descendants of immigrants, people who decided to move because they were trying to find opportunity. And we are also both countries that are great case studies in how terribly that can go for Indigenous populations and how terribly we can mix cultures and how wrong things can go, as well as how well they can go. So there's a lot of talk about risk. It's really difficult to model because so many people are making different decisions based on different values. Also, building onto the uncertainties that Robert was discussing, in terms of uncertainty in migration policy, there's a real difficulty in identifying environmental migrants. When a farmer who's faced with drought moves to the city and takes up a job, is that an environmental migration or an economic migration, right? And in terms of the farmer's experience, it doesn't matter how you label it, right? I mean, that's not a useful label. But in terms of policy, we draw these lines and we say one class is protected and another class is not. One class gets support and government assistance and the other one does not. And we draw these arbitrary lines and we draw them in different places. And this makes it very difficult. It makes it very difficult to identify why we're drawing those lines and labeling categories the way we do. But those categories are necessary in some ways to make decisions about policy, right? Who does get additional resources, who does get additional support, and who doesn't. How many people will migrate, all of the uncertainties that you laid out. And one I will add or sort of combine with the will we reduce greenhouse gases and how will we think about development is how much will we invest in adaptation? How much we will invest in the adaptive capacity, right? We're talking a lot about where migration will occur and who will happen, but how much are we going to pay? London School of Economics estimates $50 billion a year, maybe $100 billion a year by the end of the century to adapt to climate change. Those are, large numbers. Are we going to pay, to Canada and the United States, who have made large future potential commitments to foreign aid? Are we going to follow through and actually provide that aid to other countries, right? And how will that aid get allocated? are going to be critical in where does the money come from and where does the money go and how is it used, right? And is it used to prevent migration or is it used to facilitate migration will become very critical decisions moving forward. I think one of the things that's really big that we don't know very well, and this is partly because we need to learn more from migration studies as a field, I think, in the adaptation space, is that people experience migration differently. For some of them, it is an opportunity and they find benefits and they are happy with the changes and they're happy with the new places. Migration involves both loss and opportunity, right? You may be sad about the place you left and also happy that you left and have new opportunities. And for some, it is all loss and it is all harm. And I think we don't have a great understanding of why two people could have two very different experiences of that, and how can policy intervene to help ensure that people find more benefit than they do harm. Not to saying that we should be forcing migration or that this happens, but that when migration happens, we want it to be the best possible outcomes for people. And we need a lot of work thinking about how that happens, whether that's internal in a country with displaced persons that's happening, or whether that's across borders. We need a lot more conversation about how we can facilitate this. Not just how do we facilitate the physical movement of people, but how do we facilitate livelihoods in the new place? How do we facilitate the maintenance of culture? In some places, we're talking about the maintenance of a sovereign nation. How do we maintain sovereignty disconnected from territory? That's going to become a huge problem in the future. How do we prepare receiving communities for an influx of people who are bringing in new cultures, new foods, new languages, new traditions? How do we prepare for that blending of cultures? And how can we do that to benefit everyone? Those are really difficult questions, and questions that migration studies have dealt with for a long time, and that adaptation studies are just starting to engage with more meaningfully, and we need a blending of those two disciplines. So my main point is just environmental degradation is going to lead to migration. It's going to lead to people moving in Canada, in the United States, and all around the world. No country is going to be untouched by this. It is going to happen everywhere. It's going to be very difficult to think about whether these are beneficial movements or harmful movements. And right now, we don't have enough information to know when staying is the better option or when moving is the better option, or how policy can help make more benefits. So those are all areas where I think we need a lot more energy invested.
Thank you very much. I mean, you're absolutely right. We're dealing with these questions, and there's insufficient research and resources, et cetera. And yet, human history is the story of human mobility and human movement. And in some ways, we're rediscovering it because of the accelerated impact of changing climate and environment. But I think you've also done good service to remind us that we often, in the US and Canada at least, we don't think about having IDPs, internally displaced persons. But of course we do. We
don't use that language in the United States to describe displaced persons.
Of course, it's always somewhere else. It's not, but of course we have IDPs in our own countries. And I think the more we start to use that vocabulary, probably the more attention will get paid to those folks in our countries who are internally displaced due to environmental degradation caused by extreme weather occurrences that are more cyclical, more kind of, stacking up faster and faster. So it's a great reminder.
Rosemary, can I add one more comment just based on what you said about the history of human mobility? It is a history of mobility, right? As a species, we have been moving as a result of environmental degradation since before we were human. And it's only actually relatively recently that we have built up systems that make it difficult to move, right? We have created borders, we have property rights, we have fixed places, we've built up social institutions. As a lawyer, I think about we have a lot of basis on precedent. We set precedent based on the idea that the future is going to look exactly like the past, that I build a building and it is going to exist here forever because the land will exist forever. And suddenly that idea of permanence is being shown for the illusion that it is, right? This land may not be there, or it may not be arable, or it may not be livable. And we don't have social systems that are designed to deal with that impermanence or that idea of change. And so that's migration, I think, just throws that into a harsh light. It affects so many other things, but migration throws that into light that we used to have more flexibility. We've designed ourselves to be less flexible. And now we are being faced with this crisis that says all of those systems we've just built up to be not flexible suddenly need to embrace flexibility again.
Right. Thank you. Erika, in fact, turns nicely into things that you and I have discussed. You know, in the US and Canada, CIDRS has been saying, in Australia, governments and the private sector, civil society have, you know, have converged quite well around a policy agenda that we talk about is managed retreat, planned or managed. And in countries like Honduras or Bangladesh, South Sudan, or even the island states in the Pacific, to name a few, the relation between climate change and movement is much more about stressed retreat or survival retreat in more extreme situations for those most vulnerable in those societies. And then also, I think insiders hinted towards that, the challenges of trapped populations, unable to go, but also unable to stay. What are, you know, in your region, what are the policy choices that you're seeing or would like to see in the Americas that you have some confidence in to be able to grapple with this?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really grateful to be here today. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you so much to all of you for watching us. I look at this issue from several perspectives, but in our dialogue, I will be guided by Resama, our network, most recent experiences. Our work is based on an approach of promoting visibility and recognition of migrants and displaced people and its rights throughout a perspective of the disaster displacement cycle, with the integration of this issue, environmental migration, environmental displacement, in several agendas. For us, for our network, it's very important to know who are the most impacted, who are the most vulnerable groups and communities, how they live, because for us, any preparedness or response strategy must be attentive, must pay attention to the needs of each group and the particularities of each context. Regarding the question specifically, I think it's necessary to step back in this debate a little before talking about public policies. The debate about public policies, in my view, in a national level, for example, is a process under construction and depends on well-organized evidence and data to ensure a transition from a perspective of emergency focus to long-lasting strategies in the medium and long term. However, we are still very much focused on emergency and humanitarian attention. In times of crisis, it's very important, it's very relevant, especially in scenario of interaction of multiple threats as COVID, which amplified in our region, for example, historical inequalities, injustice here in the region. But I would like to mention some available strategies. I would like to call available strategies and the public policies could be inspired of these available strategies to develop more in the future. How can these strategies could be better applied in these different situations, for example. I view the current governance of human mobility by environmental factors from three main agendas. From migration agenda, in Latin America, we have the experience of humanitarian visas for temporary migratory admission and regularization for cross-border movements in the context of disasters that have been adopted in many countries of Latin America, including in Brazil, Argentina, and many other countries. In my view, this kind of strategy, the humanitarian visas and the temporary residences, cannot be considered a solution because it's a precarious measure, and it's insufficient measure to guarantee security and dignity for migrants. Just because there is no public policy behind these strategies. In the refugee regime, Latin America is one of the regions that adopt the extended definition of refugee that has recently been deepened as possible avenue of protection, but this would depend on political will of the states that have adopted this declaration. And recently, this debate has the more relevance and important in importance because the interaction of situations of violence and conflict and climate change drivers. In the region, in the regional consultative processes on migration, such as South Conference on Migration and Regional Conference on Migration, that Regional Conference on Migration, United States and Canada is part of this RCP, have developed guidelines for action by member states of RCM in the context of cross-border movements, in the context of disasters, to guide, to coordinate the actions in this context, applying existing categories, regulatory migration categories or exceptional migration categories in this context, and in order to coordinate the efforts in bilateral cooperation during the disasters and paying attention to protect people from the country and the migrants in transit, the migrants in a foreign country, for example, on humanitarian grounds. Some regional and sub-regional organizations, especially in Central America, have recently put more focus on preparedness and resilience building at national and regional levels, but with less specific focus on displacement, which in my view is often invisible in the region. And the climate agenda to gain effectiveness will depend on the implementation efforts at the national level and the multilateral strategies of, as the one mentioned by Rosemary at the beginning of our discussion, and the support of national efforts in strategies of attention of groups already affected and displaced, and simultaneously in the generation of detailed data and evidence that can adequately inform national and regional laws and public policies. In Latin America, as an example, the Peru climate change law provides, it's a unique country with a climate change law that provides a definition of environmental migration and broadly recognized groups in situations of vulnerability, adopts the gender approach, provides for a plan for prevention and attention of environmental migration, and respect the right to the community participation in the mitigation of adaptation actions. As Professor Siders pointed out, it's very important to know more and to know more about specific needs, specific contexts, specific communities, specific vulnerable groups, in order to propose adequate strategies and to incorporate as well the traditional knowledges and strategies in terms of mitigation and adaptation. Is this specific point is present in the legislation of Peru that is dependent on regulation to build this plan of prevention and attention to environmental migration. The most recent experience in Brazil related to community that I working, that I supporting nowadays. I note that total abandonment of the community by public authorities. Most of times the survival retreat is the unique option, but without the support of the authorities and to put the communities in a difficult situation because most of, in some situations, the communities act in order to make self-managed relocation. For example, is this the case of the community of Nova Enseada. I have some reference for you that you might interest. And the conditions of this community specifically affected by erosive processes and that led to the loss of original territory. The community relocated itself in a previous and self-managed way based in the traditional knowledgement. And the authorities did not give any support and obliged the community to assume all the risks of this relocation, because the proposal of the state is move to the city and leave this tradition, the culture, and all the elements important for this kind of community. In this direction, to conclude my response, it's important to emphasize when talking about a region of like Latin American, the impact of climate change is directly related to deep inequalities, historical process of exploitation, high levels of poverty and violence. But despite of this, I think that you must pay attention to make more visible the environmental triggers, the environmental factors in order to put some effort in climate agendas, in environmental agendas, and to establish some climate adaptation strategies in alignment of these different contexts. It's very important for me to make more visible these environmental factors and not hiding this agenda and put, for example, in the region, the development agenda. These agendas must be integrated, must take in action together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erika. And you know, you spoke about the national and local strategies that you're experiencing, observing. And Robert, if we can kind of take it back up to the international agenda, you know, COP26 is postponed and, you know, to November 2021, and who knows what that's going to look like in the current global environment. But it kind of bought us an extra year, the global community, to, you know, not just fulfill its commitments, but to actually put more ambitious commitments together, because things have changed dramatically since the time of the Paris Convention in 2015. But it did call in 2015 for, you know, more research on migration and displacement and planned relocations and more integrated approaches, et cetera. But, you know, with displacement, we usually look to like the 51 Refugee Convention and or the IOM and now the global compacts. But, you know, what I said in the beginning was we tend to conflate sometimes, I think, in the discussions outside of the expert communities, refugee determinations and migration and voluntary and involuntary migration. So when you think about the movements because of environmental degradation that we would say are compelled or forced, even if it's not, direct causal effect, it's off the inflection points, etc. Where do you, in these various multilateral institutions and legal frameworks that we have, where do climate displaced individuals, where did they locate their rights, and where do they locate the duty bearers to hold them responsible from your perspective? And I'm sure Siders is going to want to jump in as well.
Yeah, and I will try to keep it brief. I mean, the reality is in many cases they're on their own. But again, we're talking about a huge spectrum of people, from people who have relatively high agency in terms of their ability to make decisions about migration, in terms of whether they want to migrate or not, where they might go, when, and so on, to the other end of the spectrum, people who might be displaced completely involuntarily, have nowhere to go, have no resources to make the adjustment, or indeed, people who are completely immobile, who really might want to or need to move, but lack the means to do so and are trapped in their current locations. So it's a huge spectrum of people, and matching up with that, we have a hodgepodge of international agreements and discussions and so on, none of which really address it in its totality. You mentioned the convention, for example, the Refugee Convention, and that's the first question in the Q&A. The reality is that very few high-income countries, if any, have any appetite for revisiting the refugee definition. There's no interest in expanding that definition to identify more people as warranting protection. And one of the realities is that we do a very poor job of protecting people who already meet the definition. So there's a practical dimension there. You mentioned the IOM, International Organization for Migration, who does indeed, they do research, they do make policy recommendations on environmental migration, but they have a huge basket of things that they're trying to work on apart from the environmental part of it. So they're very stretched as well. You mentioned the Global Compact, and I know that that the other two speakers want to address that. It has a beautiful blueprint in it as to objectives and things that we ought to be doing to address climate-related migration and displacement. Unfortunately, it's a voluntary document, and very few high-income countries show any interest in adopting it. Other things that are out there, the UN Human Rights Tribunal earlier this year made a decision that countries should not deport people to other countries where their well-being might be at risk because of climate change. So that might start to leak into jurisprudence around the world. We have the Sendai framework on disaster displacement. Of course, you mentioned the COP, that's part of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change process. That could conceivably be somewhere that you might see the emergence of some sort of protocol to address climate-related displacement, but it's inching along very incrementally. And of course, that convention and that discussion also already looks at mitigating the impacts of climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the first place. So the long and the short of it is that if people's own countries are not willing to take responsibility for addressing the underlying causes of displacement or to help them when they are displaced for environmental reasons, there's not a whole lot out there in terms of formal mechanisms.
Right. I was just looking at the Q&A, and there's a number of questions. Cyrus, maybe you can take them, a bit of them, because a recurring theme among them is something that you touched on, and that is, where do we land protection obligations, responsibilities for the climate displaced? Is UNHCR and the October 2020 paper on legal considerations UNHCR put out on climate, do we land it in UNHCR? Do we land it in the Global Compacts? This is one of those areas, because it doesn't fit tidily. It's somewhere in between voluntary migration and a refugee determination process. Where is your thinking on this?
Yeah, it is so difficult for exactly the reasons, Robert, you just mentioned. It's so difficult to define, and this spectrum between forced and voluntary, it is a spectrum. And again, we create these arbitrary categories so that we can have nice legal, conventions apply here and not here, but the reality is much more mixed. And it's incredibly difficult. The case you just referred to in HCR saying that we shouldn't deport, they actually upheld New Zealand's decision to deport that specific individual. They said in general, we should consider climate change. But what they didn't do is they didn't distinguish when does climate change become so life-threatening that this creates a right. And so the court, held this up, but at the same time didn't create a nice definition that would help. And I think you're right, it will come up in future jurisprudence and we will see it elsewhere. And the law is always very slow at sort of edging towards definitions that are constantly under flux. And so I think this will be one of them. But it is so difficult to find a place to define these exactly because we can't decide what it means to be displaced by climate change, right? We, even in the scientific realm, we're arguing over attribution, right? Is any particular hurricane or any particular drought, was that caused by climate change, or is that a normal drought, a normal hurricane? And this is, from a scientific point of view, this is the wrong way to think about it, right? It's not either climate change or normal, but from a legal perspective, that becomes very difficult if you say people can be forced out due to climate change, or that someone bears the responsibility because this is climate change, but doesn't bear the responsibility if it was a normal drought or a normal hurricane, right? And so it creates this disconnect between what the science is and what the science can tell us and between where the legal ramifications are. So I apologize, I'm hedging because I don't have an answer to your question, because I think there are so many of these underlying issues that we don't also have answers to, that I think are incredibly problematic. And just one of the other questions I see in there that maybe I can touch on in terms of how do we tie, I think it is really important to tie displacement internally in these countries with the international migration, because I think there is such a connection there between, at the point where your country can no longer help support internal displacement or help support people, right? International migration and international refugee status may become necessary. And so I think there's a real connection there. There's also a real connection in places like Canada and the US that are more likely to experience an influx of international migrants and more likely to experience internal displacement than to see an outmigration. That I think there's a lot of emphasis on receiving countries like this that we can learn from internal displacement to think about how we prepare receiving communities and how we integrate migrants or displaced people into new communities, right? That integration process will be critical for both internally displaced and for international migration. And I think that's an area where, again, there's a lot of research from migration studies that we need to apply or we need to learn from. And I think there are also still a lot of unanswered questions there that we can push forward.
I think, I think we would all agree with you that there's, because of this multi-causation and trying to figure all of that out, but that we're going to have to figure that out. And that can't be a reason for no public policy action on the part of national governments. And some of the work that we're trying to do at the World Refugee Migration Council is to say, there are elements, and at certain points there are tipping points. But if you had a basket of elements and said, kind of like determinations on other migration entry points, there's a basket, and 6 out of 10 point to climate, and 4 out of 10 point to economic aspirations or whatever. We should be able to, I think, create public policy based on good factual evidentiary basis, and then create that ability to make discretionary decisions for asylum seekers where they claim that environmental degradation was the tipping point or the inflection point or a major contributing factor. And so we're trying to sort that out, because the complexity and the multi-causality cannot be a reason for no public policy in this area when you factor in the numbers that Robert laid out for us at the very beginning.
I agree. It can't be a way. It can't be a reason for inaction. And I actually wonder if there's a different model to look at here, which is, for example, how do we define a disaster? Right? We define a disaster by when the local governments or state governments are overwhelmed. At least in the U.S., that's how we define it. Right? It's just a definition by a threshold that is based not on what was the hazard. We don't list out these are certain hazards. We say these are certain places where the local government or the state government has been overwhelmed and is no longer able to help their constituents. That's when these other things kick in. And maybe there's a different threshold to be able to say, rather than looking at traditional refugees look at an individual person and say, were you persecuted by your government or by people within your country? And there was a responsibility on their national government to handle the conditions and prevent those conditions from creating these refugees. Well, now we're looking at a sort of completely different model that suggests that maybe the question is more of, at what point does this national government become so overwhelmed that they are unable to prevent these conditions, right? And so it's no longer about the individual person within the country, it's more about the national government, at which point is this country unable to provide safety within its national borders. And I don't know that that's the right way to go, but it would be a different way of thinking about the problem that might open up some opportunities for not having to rehash the same questions of attribution that we struggle with elsewhere.
Well, and I think one of the things that you're raising, and Erika and Robert, please jump in, but you know, how we organize our national institutions for disaster and for national issues as well as international issues. You know, it's hard enough for us to bring the climate activists together with the migration refugee activists who traditionally been on quite separate paths, and they come together on climate migration, but this is rather new territory where you've got very different pathways of expertise. But you know, if you think about most impacts, it's at this at level of a city or a municipality, etc., in terms of flooding or coastal erosion or storm surges, etc. And then, but you know, you've got another department of government at a national level that deals with border entry, and another that deals with disaster preparedness or response, and at all levels of government. So, you know, I think one of the questions in the Q&A is, you know, how do we actually reconcile kind of the governance at a national level, let alone at a multilateral level, to be able to manage these questions. And, you know, Robert, you've written a lot about this in terms of the governance of these issues.
Yes, and I was on a call yesterday with some folks at the World Bank about this very issue, where they're trying to get into the weeds at a regional level and see what local regional institutions exist currently, do an inventory, compare across regions, and then see how to scale up from that. And I think that, and this comes out in a couple of the questions that are in the Q&A right now, is the role for local level institutions and civil society and NGOs and multilaterals. I think that, and this comes out of Dr. Sider's point, that someone's going to have to push. And I think that push has to come from the bottom up to force the top, and to not wait for governments to make these, you know, okay, well, we'll sign on to this particular accord. Because often what happens is, okay, they get their pens out, they sign this agreement, but there's no resources that flow from that decision. So, and at the same time, I think you're right. I like what Dr. Siders was saying about the idea about thresholds and so on, and the coping capacity of communities. And I'd be interested to hear from Erika's perspective on this as well. If you could jump in, Erika, because I know you've been working with these communities on these very issues.
Thank you, Robert. In my opinion, nowadays there is a strategy more used in the world, this litigation. It's not the best strategy, but because it will be better prevention and local action, and try to establish local strategies to adapt in the territory. It depends on the communities. For example, in Brazil, we noticed some experiences in the traditional communities in Amazon that assume hybrid governance, civil society organizations with local governments, some kind of implementation of public policies in some situations, for example, to assume a seasonal migration, a cycle migration. The community that lives on the river, that deal with constant, frequent floods, has a strategy to cycle, to move, and to move and back from our territory. But it's very interesting because the people doesn't call it migration, doesn't want to call it this movement migration. And when I talked with the people and the organizations, I put this on the debate. It's a mobility. It's a mobility. The environment has all as well a mobility, and the people moving, going back, and should maintain your traditional activities. It's a very nice experience to demonstrate that local strategies, that they maintain the relationship between the communities and his traditional territories.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious of everyone's time, and I do want to go back to the panelists to kind of give us a bit of a wrap in terms of your perspectives and the conversations and the research you're seeing in terms of, where do we go next? What are you seeing on the horizon? And why are you optimistic as we go forward? Siders, I'm going to start with you. First of all, welcome back to the Paris Accord, and all good things. Are you optimistic? What do you see coming up next?
Yeah, well, it's an optimistic time for climate scientists in the United States, I think, right now, right? We realize that we need to take action, and we need to take action really quickly. And so I think there's a lot of holding our breath, seeing if we're going to take the level of action and level of commitment that is necessary. But there's hope that it could happen. In terms of migration, and specifically managed retreat, I've been very encouraged that managed retreat, discussions around managed retreat in the United States are occurring in a way that they haven't occurred in the past. Over the last decade, we've seen like an exponential growth in the willingness of places to engage in this discussion, to recognize that relocation is, migration is going to occur, and that it's going to occur in the US as well as elsewhere, that we are going to be, receiving people as well as people moving around within the United States. So even just an acknowledgement this is going to happen is it seems like a really small step, but it's a big step forward. And I think that's great. One area where I am hoping that we see a lot more movement is on understanding the process by which people move, and understanding how that process affects outcomes, because I think that's an area we still don't know enough. We know that people experience a wide range of different outcomes, but we don't know how to help those outcomes be better. And so that's an area where there's a lot, and it was really rife for a lot of research and a lot of policy innovation and experimentation to try out different things and see what works, and to learn from past experiences as well.
Thank you. That's a very optimistic horizon. Lots of work to be done, but good, positive, constructive work. Erika, how about you next?
I'm also optimistic, but I will more optimistic if when Brazil go back to the Global Compact. But I'm optimistic because I think that there is a movement accelerating, for example, to organize evidences and to develop more methodologies to better data collection. This element, in my opinion, it's crucial for public policies. I think that in a conversation of Brazilian government, they always ask, who are these people, how many, how they live, which region, and so on. I think that we should accelerate these evidences. The evidences is present, is in a point of view of it's clear, but it's necessary to deep in order to make more visible the climate triggers. But I think that we should act in these two two signs. Emergencies, it's necessary. We are now in a climate crisis scenario, but in other side, accelerate or organize the evidences, make more research to discover, to make more visible the climate triggers, to make more comprehensive the climate movements, the dynamics of climate movements. I think I'm very optimistic, but I think that is two ways and two avenues equally relevant to put this issue more visible and more concrete in terms of implementation, because I feel that we have many progresses in international agenda, but the efforts for implementations at the regional, at national and local level, it's necessary to put more energy in this. Thank you.
Thank you. And Robert, your focus has been so much on the governance. What do you think? Is it more law we need or more solidarity? Where are you landing?
Well, I'm always in favor of solidarity, that's for sure. I think that a lot of good things have come out of this discussion here and out of the Q&A in terms of, we realize we have to walk and chew gum and do other things at the same time. And so, yes, we need global governance structures for sure. We need international agreements, but we also need regional cooperation. We need bilateral cooperation. One of the questions was, well, what about small island states? Well, if Canada or the United States wanted to help small island states, we don't have to wait for the United Nations to do that. We can jump right in and start helping. So we need to think in those terms. We need civil society like the World Refugee Migration Council and other actors and church groups and community organizations to all be putting pressure simultaneously on governments and decision makers to act. I'm optimistic because the next 20 years, especially on the underlying cause of this discussion, greenhouse gas emissions, we have an opportunity to start to ratchet those back down. It all depends on political will at this point. We have the technology and the know-how to gear that back. And in terms of, this conversation here, when I first did my PhD, I could count on my fingers and toes the number of peer-reviewed studies on climate and migration. Now there's dozens coming out each week. So we have the science necessary to make policy. And one final observation, someone asked about action research and human security and where to go next for the young scholars who are on this call. I think that one of the things we've learned from COVID is that we need to think of better ways to do things in terms of looking after human security and well-being, and not just, this particular pandemic, but, hunger and malaria. And these are all interconnected with climate vulnerability, right? Because if people aren't eating properly, if they're exposed to easily preventable diseases, they're not going to have the resilience to adapt to a changing climate. So to wrap this all together, I think that there's roles for all of us, whether we're researchers, policymakers, or civil society members.
Absolutely, and the joined up both nationally, regionally, and internationally is so fundamentally important. And the pandemic has taught us anything, it's about those underlying vulnerabilities that both Erika and Siders both spoke about that, are surface and actually make these situations much more catastrophic and destructive and impacts on people that could be avoided or mitigated if we address some of these underlying inequities across the planet. Thank you all. Thank you, everyone, for the questions that came into our panelists. So thank you very much to all of the attendees from various parts of the world. And we'll continue this conversation. The World Refugee Migration Council is absolutely determined to make this a priority public policy area, both nationally and internationally. So thank you again. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.